Dust Creek, Texas, 1887. The wind swept across the prairie like a bitter reminder time spares no one, least of all the women who have outlived the age of dreaming. In the West, a 37-year-old woman with no husband, no children, and no property was seen as someone who had once been chosen and then discarded. Clara once hoped she might be the exception, but like hundreds of other women in her time, she became a mail-order bride, a product with a name and a face shipped through the mail to the hands of a stranger. Only difference was, she got sent back, unopened. He said she was too quiet, that he wanted a wife who could make small talk with the neighbors, that when he looked into Clara's eyes, he saw nothing like staring into a dry well. But the truth was, Clara wasn't empty. She was just exhausted from always having to hold herself together to make others comfortable. She had lived more than half her life trying to be proper, smiling when told to, not crying when hurt, never arguing, never asking, never dreaming beyond a home where someone might actually want to hear her speak. But even that had been deemed too much. The day she was sent away from town, the cold cut straight to the bone. She carried nothing but a torn satchel and not a single illusion left in her mind. Clara stepped onto a livestock train bound for nowhere. Each turn of the wheels whispered the same chorus from her past. You're too old. You're nothing special. You'll never be enough for someone to truly love. And yet in that silence, fate cracked open a door she never expected. A door opened by a man who could not hear. He couldn't hear her voice, but he understood her better than anyone who ever claimed to listen. If you've ever felt like Clara, living your life in quiet, just wishing someone would truly see you, then this story is for you. And if you think there are no second chances left for a woman past her prime step into the only love story where silence speaks the loudest. The train from Missouri rolled slowly into Dust Creek, Texas, groaning on the tracks like it too carried burdens that weren't its own. Dust devils danced along the edge of the station as passengers disembarked in silence, save for the clatter of trunks and the low murmur of ranch hands waiting on shipments of seed feed and horseshoes. And stepping down from that train, in a plain gray dress and a green shawl she had knitted herself, was a woman no one had been waiting for. Her name was Clara Boone, 27 years old, and everything about her seemed stitched together from leftovers. Her words were few, her eyes hesitant, her movements careful, like she'd spent a lifetime avoiding attention. She held a letter in her hand, creased and reread so many times it had worn thin where the ink had touched. The letter had promised her a new life, signed by a man named John Avery, a rancher with land horses and a desire for a quiet, obedient bride. I don't want a girl full of chatter or drama, he had written. Just someone who knows how to cook, keep house, and mind herself. Clara, orphaned since the cholera outbreak of 1868, had thought she was perfect for the role. She had always been quiet. She didn't argue. She was more comfortable listening than speaking. That wasn't a flaw, it was her survival. But as she stepped off that train and looked into the eyes of John Avery for the first time, she knew immediately she had made a mistake. John looked past her as if expecting someone else, his brow furrowed, his mouth tightened. He approached only after a long pause, as though doing so out of obligation. "You're Miss Boone," Clara nodded, holding out her gloved hand. He didn't take it. "You're smaller than I expected," he muttered, "and younger. You look nervous." She gave a quiet smile, unsure of what response would be acceptable. "I suppose we'll see," he added, and turned on his heel, expecting her to follow. The Avery Ranch wasn't large by Texas standards, but it sat on good land. The house had 2 bedrooms, a modest kitchen, and a wooden porch that creaked in the wind. Clara was shown the spare room, not the master bedroom. Her trunk was left at the foot of the bed. Over the next days, she tried her best to be everything John had asked for. She cooked meals, simple, hearty dishes she'd learned in the orphanage. She cleaned the kitchen until the floorboards shone. She even mended John's socks when she noticed the holes. But John never said thank you. He never smiled. He rarely spoke. Then came the criticism. "You're too quiet," he snapped one morning when she didn't answer a rhetorical question quickly enough. "Makes a man feel like he's going mad talking to a shadow." At supper, he barked, "You never say what's on your mind. Don't you have opinions, or are you just a hollow thing?" She tried to explain, but softly. Always softly. "I do think, Mr. Avery, I just speak up for God's sake. I need a wife, not a ghost." Clara swallowed her shame, her voice, her pain. She began writing down thoughts in a small book instead, hoping maybe he'd read it and understand. But he never noticed the book on the mantel. And one day, without warning, he simply told her, "This isn't going to work. I need a woman with a spark. You're just too empty. I'll pay your train back to Missouri." She didn't answer. She couldn't. That night, she sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the spare room, staring out the window at a moonlit field. Somewhere out there, a horse neighed softly, and the wind rustled dry cornstalks. She wanted to cry, but had learned long ago to do it silently. The next morning, she packed her trunk herself. No one helped. No one asked her to stay. The kitchen table she'd polished still bore crumbs from the breakfast he didn't thank her for. Clara took one last look at the place and turned to leave. At the station, she sat alone on the bench with her bag at her feet and a heart cracked but not broken. It was then she saw him. He wasn't like other men in Dust Creek. He wasn't watching her with pity or suspicion. He didn't whisper with others about the mail order girl who'd failed. He simply stood a few paces away, his eyes steady, a soft furrow in his brow, like he was reading something others couldn't see. He was tall with a strong build and a leather vest over his broad shoulders. His face was sun-worn, and there was a certain stillness to him, not the lazy stillness of disinterest, but the focused stillness of someone who'd learned to listen with his whole body. And when Clara glanced up, their eyes met. He smiled not with his mouth but with his eyes. Then he signed something with his hands. Clara blinked, startled. He signed again, slower. Her heart jumped. She had grown up with a deaf girl in the orphanage, Anna, and had learned the basics of sign language out of kindness, out of curiosity, out of loneliness. It had always felt like magic hands speaking in silence, saying things words couldn't. Clara slowly signed back. "Do you need something?" He grinned now, warm, wide, delighted. "No," he replied with his hands. "Just thought you looked like someone I could talk to." Her chest ached, not from pain, but from the sudden swelling of something that felt like being seen. Not heard, but seen. He sat beside her. Didn't crowd, didn't stare, just existed quietly beside her. He pulled a small notepad from his coat and wrote, "My name's Eli. I saw the way they looked at you. Thought maybe you could use some company that doesn't judge." She smiled shyly and wrote back, "I'm Clara, and thank you." They sat there for hours, writing, signing, smiling, while the train whistle sounded in the distance, and the world for once didn't rush them. What Clara didn't know then was that Eli Kerrigan wasn't just a passing kindness. He was a man with his own wounds, his own silence, and a heart that had waited far too long to find a voice that spoke not in volume, but in truth. Eli Kerrigan didn't ask where she was going. He didn't ask why her dress looked travel-worn, or why her eyes were the color of ash before rain. He didn't offer to carry her bag or ask her to smile. He simply sat beside Clara like a man who understood the price of silence because he had paid it his whole life. He gestured slowly. "I have a wagon. I live outside of town. If you need somewhere to be, not forever, just until you decide what's next, it's yours." Clara hesitated. She had no family, no money, and no place to return to. Her soul had been dismissed like spoiled milk discarded by a man who said she was too empty. But here was someone who didn't look at her like she was lacking anything. She signed back, "Why?" Eli's answer was written on paper. "Because I know what it's like to be looked at but never seen." The Kerrigan homestead sat on the edge of Dust Creek, nestled between two tired hills and a grove of juniper trees that always smelled like rain. The house was small, warm, and filled with signs of a life lived in solitude, but not neglect, books stacked beside a rocking chair, wildflowers in a whiskey bottle on the table. Tools hung carefully along the barn wall. Eli had built it all himself after the war, after the explosion that had taken his hearing in a flash of orange fire and screaming silence. His world had been reduced to vibrations, to gestures, to shadows moving across mouths. But in that stillness, he'd grown a second kind of sight, the kind that noticed more. He saw the way Clara's hands trembled when she made tea. He noticed how she waited 3 seconds before speaking, as if measuring the risk of every word. He noticed how her eyes lingered on children's books, especially the ones with watercolor animals and very few words. He didn't ask. He simply handed her a mug of tea one morning and signed, "You don't need to explain you're quiet. It's safe here." And for the first time in months, maybe years, Clara exhaled fully. As days passed into weeks, they fell into a rhythm. They worked the land together, she planting herbs, he fixing fences. They shared notes over supper. When she cooked something new, he'd write his compliments on scraps of paper and pin them to the kitchen wall like awards. When the wind howled at night, she'd light a candle and sit beside him, reading aloud with care, making sure her lips moved clearly so he could follow. Clara had never known this kind of companionship. Not the fiery, breathless kind she'd read about in dime novels, but something steadier, a slow-growing thing, like seeds planted in quiet earth. Sometimes he'd show her old sketches from his soldiering days, people he met, landscapes he remembered. One showed a girl standing alone at a train station, her face hidden in shadow. "I drew this years ago," he signed. "Didn't know why. I think it was you." She touched the paper gently, as if afraid it might vanish under her fingertips. One afternoon, after digging in the garden, Eli brought her a box. Inside were items wrapped in cloth ink pens, a stack of unused journals, and a small silver locket shaped like a dove. Clara looked up confused. He handed her a note. "Not because you need fixing, but because maybe it's time someone gave you tools to tell your story on your terms." Her hands shook as she held the journal. Her throat burned. No one had ever invited her to be heard. Not until now. That evening, a storm rolled in from the west, drumming against the windows as Clara sat near the fire, writing in one of the journals. She didn't write about John Avery. She didn't write about the shame or the rejection or the way she'd once rehearsed sentences in her head before daring to speak them aloud. She wrote about the first time she had seen Eli smile, about the way he nodded with his whole body when she read him a passage from Little Women, about the silence between them that never felt empty. Outside, thunder cracked. Inside, warmth bloomed. Eli walked over and placed a single book beside her, Wuthering Heights. He signed, "It's about two people who never said what they felt until it was too late." She looked at him, heart thudding. Then she signed back, "I don't want to be too late." He stared for a long moment, then wrote, "Neither do I." The next morning, Clara stood on the porch with her journal tucked to her chest. The sky had cleared, leaving behind a trail of dew and gold. She turned to Eli, who was hitching the wagon for town. "I want to go with you," she said, voice clear. He paused. She hadn't spoken out loud in days, maybe weeks. "I want people to see me beside you. I'm not ashamed anymore." He climbed down, met her at the steps. "Sign slowly, then let's go, as ourselves." They rode into Dust Creek with nothing to prove, just two people who had found in each other a language deeper than sound. But in towns like Dust Creek, silence is never truly safe. Clara's past wasn't finished with her. And some voices, no matter how long silenced, will always find a way back to echo in the present. A woman once dismissed as too quiet found her voice in the heart of a man who couldn't hear sound, but felt every beat of her soul. Yet their love was more than liberation, it became a promise. A promise of a future where two people once cast aside would build a home together, rooted in listening, compassion, and understanding. That summer came like a quiet blessing, not rushed, not showy. Just warm days, soft afternoon rains, and golden light stretching across the barley fields behind the Kerrigan Ranch. Clara typed the final lines of her first manuscript. The title was simple, When Silence Speaks. It wasn't a retaliation against her past, but a love song, gentle and true, for those who had been forgotten, dismissed for being too quiet, or for not fitting into a mold. Eli was the first to read it in his own way. Each night by the fire, Clara sat beside him and read aloud, signing with her hands, brushing her fingers against his as she spoke each sentence. He listened with his heart, and she told her story with her eyes. One morning they went to the town fair, not to draw attention, not to make a statement, just two people standing side by side like two patches of earth that had finally found where they belonged. The people of Dust Creek, who once whispered and stared, now only nodded quietly when they saw them. Not everyone understood, but they all sensed something about this couple. Made you want to believe. Believe that you don't have to shout to have worth. That love isn't a performance, it's a presence. At the fair, a young woman named Sarah walked up to Clara, her voice hushed, almost embarrassed. "Were you the one who wrote that article in the Morning Post about the mute bride?" Clara nodded. Sarah hesitated, then looked up with tearful eyes. I was forced to marry, too. I didn't leave because I was afraid they'd call me shameful. But reading your words, I didn't feel so alone anymore." Clara took her hand. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. In that moment, she understood her quiet words written in the dark had reached a soul that longed to be heard. The following Sunday, Eli led Clara up the hill behind the ranch to the place where he'd sat alone for so many years. The old oak still stood tall, bearing witness to the solitude he once knew. That day, he laid a cloth over the grass and gently pulled Clara down beside him. In his hand was a small wooden box. He opened it. No ring, no gold, just a silver necklace. And at its center, a pendant shaped like a tiny earplug carved from white quartz. He wrote in her palm, "I cannot hear you with my ears, but I will always wear you next to my heart." Clara didn't cry. This moment wasn't for tears, it was for gratitude, for rebirth. They didn't hold a grand wedding. Just a quiet gathering. A few neighbors, a handful of orphaned children Clara had once taught to read, and a harmonica song played by a blind boy from the orphanage. No loud vows. Just Clara placing her hand over Eli's heart, and Eli placing his hand over hers. Silence, but forever. After the wedding, they opened a place called the Quiet Hearth. A small refuge where women who had been cast aside, labeled unfit or not enough, could come live, learn, write, and rediscover their worth. No one was required to speak. Presence was enough. Clara had once been called too quiet. Eli had been labeled too silent. But between them there was never a lack of sound, because true love doesn't need to be loud. It only needs someone brave enough to stay to listen and to believe that even in silence, a heart is always calling home. She was once rejected for saying too little. He was forgotten by the world for hearing nothing at all. Yet in that very silence they found what the loudest voices never could: unconditional understanding, a love that asked for nothing, and a home where quiet was cherished like a sacred song. In the years that followed, the Quiet Hearth was never a refuge nor a convent. It was a place where no one had to explain why they came. They only needed to show up and live. Clara was no longer the woman who once bowed her head in the freezing rail car. Now she was the midwife for single mothers turned away by the town, the one who taught mute girls how to sign, the woman who helped widows write petitions to reclaim land taken from them by heartless laws. Eli remained as quiet as he'd always been. He cared for the horses, taught boys how to mend fences, even built simple mechanical tools to help the women around the homestead work more easily. He didn't need applause. Clara's nod was all the affirmation he ever wanted. One winter's day, someone knocked at the Quiet Hearth. A girl of maybe 17 stood there, hair tangled, dress torn, holding a newborn wrapped in a frayed blanket. A fresh bruise marked her neck. Clara opened the door. She didn't ask a single question. She just smiled. The girl broke down not out of pain, but because she knew she had come to the right place. Later, Clara wrote in her journal, "People think love is something you have to fight for, something you have to win. But I've learned that true love is quieter than that. It's simply someone who's still there when you can't speak yet, someone brave enough to stay through the silence." On the 5th anniversary of the day Clara first stepped foot in Dust Creek, she and Eli stood beneath the old oak tree, the place where he had once given her the quartz necklace. This time Clara carried a small wooden box. She handed it to him. Inside was a letter written in Braille. No one knew how long she had spent teaching herself to etch it by hand, night after night in silence. The letter read, "Ray, if one day I'm no longer beside you, read these words not with your eyes but with your hands. Because our love never needed ears. It never needed speech. It lives in every heartbeat and in the quiet places no one else had the patience to understand." Eli held the letter and pulled her close. The wind swept hard through the trees. No one said a word. And there was no need. Clara Boone was once a mail-order bride cast aside for being too quiet. But she rewrote her life with that very silence, where every step, every glance, every breath became the answer to the question she had carried her whole life. Is there anyone who truly listens to me? And she found him, not someone who listened with ears, but with his heart. In Dust Creek, when night falls and the hearth still glows, warm people sometimes speak of a woman whose eyes were as gentle as the October sky, and a man who never spoke but loved, as if the whole world were quietly listening. Clara and Eli Kerrigan didn't become legends through gunfights or galloping horses. They became something rarer, a living truth that some love stories don't need whiskey music or a full moon, only two souls brave enough to look into each other's eyes without fear of silence. Years later, folks would ask Clara why she never left Dust Creek, why she didn't move to the city, publish more books, or open writing schools for women. She would just smile and say, "Because this is the first place where someone truly saw me without asking me to be someone else." One late afternoon, Clara was out in the garden when Sarah's little girl, the daughter of the young woman who once knocked on the Quiet Hearth's door, ran up tugging at her skirt. "Aunt Clara, why doesn't Uncle Eli ever talk?" Clara knelt down and gently brushed the child's hair back. "He does speak, sweetheart, just not in a way everyone can hear. But I hear him loud and clear." The girl tilted her head. "So, that means one day I won't have to talk real loud to be loved." "Right." Clara wrapped the girl in her arms, her eyes resting on Eli, across the yard, quietly fixing a horseshoe in the stable. "You only ever have to be yourself, my dear. True words from the heart. never need to be shouted. Final scene, like a letter left for the viewer soft as a prayer. If you've ever been overlooked for not being loud enough, if you've ever felt too quiet to be seen, if you've ever wondered whether your heart was worth hearing, please remember there are still people like Eli Kerrigan in this world. They don't need you to say the perfect thing. They don't need you to speak often or boldly. They just need you to be real. And someday when the world grows tired of all the noise, it will be your quiet, steady heart that becomes the place someone chooses to call home. What if the quietest parts of ourselves were the ones most worth listening to? Clara Boone's journey reminds us that silence doesn't mean emptiness, that sometimes the deepest hearts are the ones that speak the least, not because they have nothing to say, but because the world has rarely listened. In a world quick to dismiss the aging, the gentle, or the different, this story is a quiet rebellion, a testimony that real love, is not loud, flashy, or young. It is steady, it sees, and sometimes it hears what words cannot express. For those of us who have lived long enough to know disappointment, heartbreak, and the ache of being misunderstood, Clara's story may feel familiar, but let it also be a gentle reminder you are not invisible. Your story is still unfolding. And somewhere, someone may still be waiting to hear your heart, even if they can't hear your voice. If this story touched something inside you, we invite you to subscribe to None, Wild West Saga, where every week we share tales of quiet strength, second chances, and love that endures even the harshest frontier. Hit subscribe, leave a comment, tell us your thoughts or memories this story stirred. Share this with someone who needs to believe love doesn't have an expiration date, because sometimes the greatest stories begin after the world thinks yours is over.